The water hit the crossing like a fist, and Charlotte Hart's mare screamed as the ground fell away beneath its hooves. She had crossed Sweetgrass Creek a dozen times that spring, driving 3 prized Hereford bulls and 8 bred heifers north toward the Bitterroot Valley for a rancher who was paying her father's outfit more money than they had seen in 2 years. But the creek she remembered was gone, replaced by a brown, roaring flood that had swallowed the old log crossing sometime in the night, likely from snowmelt released too fast by a warm rain higher in the peaks. Charlotte had ridden ahead of the small herd to test the ford, the way her father had taught her since she was 12 years old, and now the current was dragging her mare sideways toward a tangle of driftwood and broken timber where the bridge used to stand. "Easy, Delia, easy now," Charlotte called, though her own voice shook as badly as the water. She kicked free of the stirrups just as the mare stumbled on a submerged rock, and the world tipped. Cold slammed into her like a wall, stealing the breath clean out of her lungs, and for a moment there was nothing but roar and dark and the taste of silt. She surfaced once, gasped, saw the bank spinning away from her and went under again. It was the reins wrapped twice around her wrist that saved her, though they nearly killed her too. Delia fought for the far bank with the desperate strength of a horse that wanted solid ground beneath her, and Charlotte was hauled along like a sack behind her, banging against a submerged log hard enough to knock the wind from her a second time. When the mare finally found footing in the shallows and lurched up onto a spit of gravel and willow, Charlotte crawled the last few feet on her hands and knees, coughing up creek water, her hat gone, her dark hair plastered flat against her skull, one boot missing. She lay there a long moment, cheek against wet stone, listening to her own heartbeat pound louder than the flood. That was when she heard the horse, not her own trembling mare, standing hip-shot and blowing hard a few feet away, but another animal heavier, coming down through the lodgepole pines on the near slope with a rider's weight settled easy in the saddle despite the roughness of the ground. Charlotte pushed herself up on one arm, blinking creek water from her eyes, and saw him. He was, she would think later, the largest man she had ever seen sit a horse. Cyrus Bridger rode a big buckskin gelding down the last pitch of the trail, as though the animal were an extension of his own considerable frame, one gloved hand loose on the reins, the other resting on his thigh near a long-bladed knife sheathed at his belt. He wore a fringed elk-hide coat open over a broad chest and shoulders that strained the seams of his shirt, and his dark hair, threaded here and there with premature gray, hung past his collar, pushed back from a face weathered brown by sun and wind and marked with the kind of stillness that came from a man used to long silences. He looked, Charlotte thought with the strange clarity that sometimes comes after nearly drowning, like something the mountains themselves had made, rather than something merely born and raised in them. He was off the buckskin before it had fully stopped, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides, and crouched beside her in the mud without a word of greeting, his big hands moving over her shoulders and arms with a quick, assessing pressure that was neither rough nor timid. Anything broken? His voice was low, graveled, the voice of a man who did not waste words on people or animals. "I do not believe so." Charlotte's own voice came out thinner than she intended. "My cattle." "Your cattle can wait a moment longer than you can." He looked past her to the far bank, where the small herd had bunched together in obvious distress at the edge of the washed-out crossing, bawling at the water and at their missing point rider. "You were driving those alone, with 2 hired men. They fell back to nurse a lame horse a mile behind. I rode ahead to scout the ford." She struggled to sit up fully, and his hand came under her elbow, steadying her without pulling her off balance, a small courtesy that told her more about him in that instant than any word could have. "The bridge was there 3 days ago. It is not there now." He said it flatly, not as an accusation of her judgment, simply as a fact laid alongside the flood. His gray eyes, she saw now that she was close enough, were the color of granite under rain, and they moved over the wreckage of timber jammed against the rocks downstream, with a considering intensity that made her wonder what exactly he was seeing there that she was not. "You are Cyrus Bridger," she said, because the name had reached her even out here, carried on the tongues of men at trading posts and lined shacks from Fort Benton to the Bitterroot. The tracker men hired when the sheriff's posse lost a trail in the high country. The man some called a hermit and others called something worse, though none of them, as far as Charlotte had ever heard, could say they had seen him do a single dishonest thing. "I am." He did not seem surprised that she knew him, nor pleased by it. "And you are half drowned and a long way from anywhere with breeding stock. Nobody in their right mind drives through this country alone in spring runoff." "I am not alone. I told you, I have 2 hired men." 2 hired men, a mile back with a lame horse, do not make you not alone, when the water is doing what it is doing right now. He rose, offering her his hand, and when she took it she felt the true measure of his strength for the first time, the effortless way he brought her to her feet as though she weighed nothing at all, though she was not a small woman and knew it. "Can you stand? Can you walk?" "I can do both." She proved it, though her knees wanted otherwise, and reached instinctively for Delia's trailing reins to steady the mare as much as herself. Cyrus watched her do it, some small adjustment happening behind his still gray eyes, a recalculation she could not quite name. "Good horse sense," he said, "catching your mare's head instead of standing there shaking. Most folks forget the animal needs comforting too. I have been driving stock since I was 12 years old, Mr. Bridger. I do not forget much about animals." Something that was almost a smile moved at the corner of his mouth there and gone so fast she might have imagined it. "No," he said, "I do not suppose you do." He turned then toward the ruined crossing, and Charlotte, following his gaze, saw for the first time what his stillness had already told her he had noticed. The old bridge had not simply washed away in a flood. Where the main support timbers should have sheared and splintered from the force of water and debris, several of the heavy crossbeams lay in the wreckage cut clean through, axe marks visible even at this distance, pale wood showing where the current had not yet stained it dark. "That was cut," Charlotte said slowly, cold moving through her that had nothing to do with the creek water still soaking her clothes. "Before the flood took it. Someone cut it. Someone did." Cyrus's voice had gone flatter still, and dangerous in a way it had not been a moment before. "And I mean to know who." The 2 hired men, a taciturn older cowhand named Whit Collier and a younger one called Sam Ostrander, arrived within the half-hour, leading the lame horse and looking considerably alarmed to find their employer's daughter soaked to the bone, and standing beside the biggest, most unsettling stranger either of them had ever laid eyes on. Cyrus said little to them beyond confirming that the crossing was impassable, and that the herd would need to be held on high ground until a new way over the creek could be arranged. But there was enough authority in the way he said it that neither man questioned him, not even when he informed them all, without particular ceremony, that the nearest safe shelter was his own cabin 2 miles upslope, and that Charlotte at minimum was riding there directly before the cold took hold of her properly. "I have cattle to see to," Charlotte protested, though her teeth had begun to chatter in a manner that undercut her argument considerably. "Your cattle are not going anywhere they can drown between now and when your color comes back," Cyrus said. "Your men can hold them on the grass yonder. There is graze enough, and the creek will drop some by evening even if the crossing does not mend itself." He looked at Whit and Sam in turn, an appraising, not unkind look. "You 2 know how to hold a bunch of bred heifers off a bad bank without losing your nerve or your horses." "We have done harder," Whit said, with the wounded pride of a man twice Cyrus's junior in reputation being questioned on his own competence. "Then do it a while longer, and I will send down blankets and coffee before dark." Cyrus swung back up onto the buckskin with the same fluid economy he had shown dismounting, and reached down a hand toward Charlotte. "Miss Hart, unless you would rather argue with the cold instead of me." Charlotte, dripping and furious at her own weakness and grateful despite herself, took his hand and let him swing her up in front of him rather than behind, an arrangement she noted with faint surprise put her securely against the solid wall of his chest and arm rather than clinging to a stranger's back, and was somehow, in its practicality, less improper than it might otherwise have been. His coat still smelled of wood smoke and pine pitch and horse, and beneath it she could feel the steady, enormous strength of him holding her upright without effort, the way she imagined a great tree might hold up a bird that had lit on its branch, barely noticing the weight. "You know my name," she said, as the buckskin picked its way up through the wet timber. "I did not give it. Whit Collier hollered it 3 times crossing that meadow just now, hollering fit to wake the dead asking after his Miss Hart." Cyrus's chest moved against her back in something that might have been a low, private laugh. "I would have to be considerably worse at my trade than I am, not to catch a name shouted that many times inside a minute." Despite everything, despite the cold and the fear and the sick knowledge of what that cut timber meant, Charlotte found herself almost smiling. Cyrus Bridger's cabin sat in a stand of old-growth fir on a shelf of ground above the creek, solid and low, and built with the kind of careful joinery that told Charlotte more about the man than his reputation ever had. A stone chimney rose from one end, smoke already beginning to curl from it as Cyrus built up the banked coals inside with quick, economical movements. And within minutes he had a fire roaring and a kettle set to heat, and had turned his broad back politely to the room while directing Charlotte toward a curtained-off corner where, he said without looking around, she would find a wool blanket and a spare shirt that would swallow her twice over but would be dry, which was the only virtue that mattered at present. You keep a spare shirt for stray women you find half drowned at ruined crossings? Charlotte asked, working at the buttons of her sodden riding jacket with fingers still clumsy from cold. "I keep spare shirts because I go through a fair number of my own, tearing them on deadfall and brush." A pause, and when he spoke again there was the faintest roughness in it that told her the question had landed somewhere true despite its teasing delivery. "You are the first stray woman, if it is truth you are after." "It generally is," Charlotte said, and heard him make a low sound of acknowledgment before he stepped outside, ostensibly to see to the horses, though she suspected it was as much to give her privacy as anything else. She emerged some minutes later wrapped in his shirt and the blanket both, hair still damp but no longer dripping, and found him crouched at the hearth arranging coffee to boil, his coat shed now so that she could see plainly, in the firelight, the true breadth of his shoulders and the corded strength along his forearms where his sleeves were rolled back. He glanced up at her entrance, something flickering behind his eyes that he mastered quickly, and gestured her toward a chair near the fire without comment on her appearance, for which she was grateful. "That bridge did not cut itself," Charlotte said, settling into the offered chair, unwilling to let the matter rest even with her body still aching from the flood. "And it was not the only crossing on this stretch. If someone means to strand cattle drives and travelers on this side of the creek, they mean to profit from it somehow." Cyrus poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handed her one, and sat across from her on an upturned round of firewood that served the cabin as a second seat, his big hands wrapped around his own cup, as though the heat of it were a comfort he rarely allowed himself. "There is a man named Otis Prewitt runs a trading post and a rope ferry a half-day's ride from here, at the mouth of Sawtooth Canyon. He has been buying up the old toll rights along this stretch of country for 2 years now, quiet-like, a claim here, a filed easement there. If every other crossing for 10 miles either way happens to wash out or burn or fall apart this same spring, and his ferry is the only way left across dangerous country, he stands to make himself a very wealthy man off every drover, every family, every load of freight that has no other choice but to pay his price. You believe he is behind this? I believe it is worth finding out." Cyrus's gray eyes held hers over the rim of his cup, steady and unhurried. "I have been asked by 3 different outfits in the last month to look into missing stock and burned line shacks that never quite made sense on their own. I did not have the whole shape of it until I saw those axe marks on that timber today." He paused. Your father's herd was meant to cross here. If word had gone ahead that this crossing was down, would your outfit have gone another way, or gone to Prewitt's ferry instead? Charlotte considered this, turning her cup slowly between her palms, feeling the warmth seep back into fingers that had been numb an hour before. There is no other way, not for cattle, not through that canyon country to the north. We would have had to go to the ferry, and pay whatever toll he asked, because the alternative would have been turning back 100 miles with animals that cannot afford the extra weeks on the trail. Then you begin to see the shape of it, Cyrus said quietly, and something in his stillness had gone hard and cold in a way that made Charlotte glad, for the first time in her life, that a man like this one seemed inclined to be on her side rather than against it. They sat a while longer in the firelight, the storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally breaking outside in a hard, steady rain that drummed against the cabin's roof shakes and turned the world beyond the single small window to gray streaming dusk. Charlotte found herself watching Cyrus in the unguarded moments when he thought her attention elsewhere, noting the way he moved even at rest with the coiled economy of a man who had spent a great many years alone and trusted almost nothing to chance, and the way his eyes, when they did meet hers, held neither the leering assessment nor the careful blankness she had grown used to from men who did not quite know what to make of a woman who rode and roped and drove cattle as well as any man in her father's outfit. "You are not afraid of me," Cyrus said abruptly, into a silence that had stretched comfortable rather than awkward. "Most folks in the settlements are, one way or another. Sheriff calls me in when his posse has lost a trail 3 days running and needs a man who can read sign nobody else can find, and then half of them look at me like they are not sure whether they have hired help or trouble. Should I be afraid of you?" Charlotte asked, genuinely curious rather than provoking. "I have never given anyone cause to be, that I know of." He said it simply, without either boast or false modesty, a man stating a fact about himself the way he might state the weather. "But I have found people are afraid of what they cannot place easy in a category, more than they are afraid of anything a man actually does. I judge people by what they do, Mr. Bridger, not by the shape of their shoulders or the length of their hair or the stories that get told about them at trading posts by men who have never met them." Charlotte met his eyes squarely across the fire. "You pulled me out of that water without asking a single question first. You have spent the last hour talking about how to protect my family's herd and every other outfit in this valley from a man cheating them blind, instead of talking about anything that would profit you. That is what I have to go on, and it is enough." Something moved through Cyrus's face then, something that looked almost like pain before it settled into a quiet, unguarded gratitude that he did not put into words, only into the long, steady look he gave her before he rose to bank the fire for the night and see about proper supper, as though the moment had asked more of him than he was quite ready to answer aloud. Rain kept up through the night, and by the gray light of morning Charlotte woke on a pallet of blankets near the hearth to find Cyrus already gone out to check the horses and the weather, the cabin quiet except for the settling of coals and the drip of water off the eaves outside. She lay a moment longer than she needed to, turning over the strange fact of where she found herself and how little afraid she was of it, before rising to dress in her own clothes, dried stiff but serviceable, near the fire. Outside, the world had been rinsed clean and impossibly green. The wildflowers that had been closed tight against yesterday's storm now flung open across every meadow in a riot of lupin and balsam root and paintbrush. The mountains beyond wearing fresh snow on their highest shoulders, even as the valley floor bloomed with the promise of full spring. Cyrus stood near the corral checking the buckskins off foreleg and looked up as she approached, something in his face easing at the sight of her upright and steady and clearly none the worse for her ordeal. "Creeks dropped some in the night," he said. "Your men held the herd fine. I sent down that coffee and blankets I promised before first light. You did not have to do that. I said I would." He straightened, giving the buckskin a final pat, and looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his particular way of weighing a thing before he committed to saying it aloud. "I mean to ride down to Sawtooth Canyon today and have a look at Otis Prewitt's ferry operation for myself, and at the other crossings between here and there, see how many of them have suffered the same kind of bad luck as yours. It would go easier and faster with someone alongside who knows this country's cattle trails as well as you evidently do, and who has as much reason as anyone to want the truth of it known." Charlotte did not hesitate. "Then I am coming with you." "Your herd." "My herd is fine on good grass with 2 capable men holding it, and will still need to cross somewhere in the next day or 2, regardless of what we find at that canyon. If there is a plot to strand every outfit in this valley behind a toll ferry, I mean to see the truth of it with my own eyes, Mr. Bridger, not hear it second-hand from a man however trustworthy, and decide for myself what my father's outfit ought to do about it." She met the faint, approving quirk of his mouth with a level look of her own. "Besides, you said yourself a good tracker needs someone who knows the ground he is reading." "I did say that." Cyrus's low laugh, when it came, was a rare and startling thing, warming something in his weathered face that made him look, for just a moment, considerably younger than his years. "Saddle your mare then, Miss Hart. We have a canyon to ride to, and I would as soon do it before this fine weather turns again." They rode out within the hour, following the swollen creek downstream through country that grew steadily wilder and more dramatic, granite outcrops shouldering up through stands of lodgepole and fir, the wildflowers giving way in the higher draws to lingering patches of old snow that steamed faintly under the strengthening sun. Cyrus rode with the easy watchfulness of a man reading the land as he moved through it, pointing out to Charlotte, without condescension, the places where deadfall had been cleared too neatly to be accidental, the fresh-cut stumps half hidden in brush that told of a crew working quietly and recently to close off alternate routes through the canyon country. "Someone has spent real money on this," Charlotte said, reining Delia up beside a second washed-out crossing that showed the same telltale axe marks as the first. "Cutting timber, clearing trails to nowhere, all of it costs labor and time. Whoever is behind it means to hold this valley by the throat for years, not just this one season." "Otis Prewitt does not have that kind of money on his own," Cyrus said, his gray eyes narrowed against the glare off the water. "He owns a trading post and a rope ferry, not a fortune. Someone is backing him. A cattle buyer, maybe, or a freight company that stands to profit from every outfit in this valley being forced to sell or ship through a single controlled point." He looked at her, something grim and thoughtful in his expression. "Your father's herd is bound for a rancher in the Bitterroot." "Who arranged the sale?" Charlotte's stomach turned cold as the pieces began, unwillingly, to align. "A buyer's agent came through our range 3 months ago, a man named Harlan Voss. He offered better prices than we had seen in years, on the condition we drove the herd ourselves rather than shipping by rail, since the rail spur does not reach far enough north yet to matter. He was very particular about the route we ought to take. This route." She looked at Cyrus, feeling something like dread and something like clarity arrive together. "If Voss is buying up herds all across this valley on the promise of good prices, and steering every one of those herds toward Prewitt's ferry as the only safe crossing, and if Voss and Prewitt are working together, then every outfit that sells to him ends up paying his toll besides, one way or another, and any outfit that refuses him finds itself stranded with cattle it cannot move and cannot afford to hold through another season." Cyrus finished the thought grimly. "It is a tidy scheme, and a cruel one. It preys on exactly the kind of hardworking families who can least afford to lose a season's herd to bad luck they had no way of foreseeing." "Then we had better find proof of it," Charlotte said, jaw set, "because I do not intend to let my father's outfit, or anyone else's, be squeezed dry by men too cowardly to rob honestly at the point of a gun." Cyrus looked at her a long moment, something warm and fierce moving behind his granite gray eyes, and Charlotte thought, not for the first time since the flood had first thrown her into his path, that she had never in her life met a man whose regard felt so entirely like being seen rather than merely looked at. "No," he agreed softly. "I do not suppose you do." They reached the mouth of Sawtooth Canyon in the late afternoon, the land opening out around a wide, slow stretch of the creek, where a heavy rope ferry, little more than a raft lashed to a guide cable strung bank to bank, waited beside a ramshackle trading post flying a hand-painted sign advertising fair prices and safe passage. A handful of men loitered near the post's porch, and among them, unmistakable even at a distance by the fine cut of his coat against the roughness of his company, stood a lean man with pale eyes and a gambler's careful stillness, whom Cyrus identified under his breath as Otis Pruitt himself. They did not approach directly. Cyrus drew them back into a stand of timber overlooking the crossing, and for the better part of an hour they watched in patient silence as a freight wagon arrived, its driver arguing loudly and uselessly over a toll that had apparently doubled in price since his last crossing a month before paying it with the resigned fury of a man who had no other choice. Charlotte watched Pruitt pocket the coin with a thin smile and felt her hands tighten on her reins. "There," Cyrus said quietly, nodding toward a second rider approaching the post from the north, a well-dressed man on a fine bay horse whose bearing marked him instantly, even before Charlotte's sharpening eyes confirmed the face, as the very buyer's agent who had contracted her father's herd 3 months before. "Harlan Voss," she breathed. They watched Voss dismount and speak with Pruitt in low, easy tones that spoke of long familiarity, the two men laughing together over something before Voss handed across what was unmistakably a fold of paper money, thick enough to represent a considerable sum, before mounting again and riding off north along a trail that Charlotte recognized, with a fresh chill, as running directly toward the higher crossings where her father's outfit and half a dozen others were even now converging with their herds. "That is enough for me to act on," Cyrus said grimly, once Voss had ridden well out of sight. "It is not courtroom proof, not on its own. But it is enough to know where to press and who to press it against. What do? We do not confront Pruitt alone, not with that many men around him and no law within a day's ride to back a claim of sabotage." Cyrus's jaw was tight, his eyes still on the trading post below with the fixed, patient intensity Charlotte imagined he brought to tracking men through country that had swallowed their sign 3 days before. "But there is a crossing 2 miles above here, an old ford your father's outfit and every other in this valley used before Pruitt's ferry went in, that I have reason to believe was not cut like the others, only left to wash out on its own because nobody has kept the old log bridge in repair in years. If that crossing could be made safe again, quickly, before the rest of these herds converge here with nowhere else to go, it would take the teeth clean out of Pruitt's toll and Voss's scheme both, at least for this season, and buy time enough to bring real evidence and real law into this valley." Charlotte looked at him, feeling something fierce and hopeful kindle where dread had been sitting cold in her chest. "You mean to rebuild a bridge?" "I mean for us to rebuild a bridge," Cyrus corrected, with a faint, determined smile that did not reach all the way to the worry still visible in his eyes. "It will not be fast, and it will not be easy, and we have perhaps 3 days before the first of those other outfits reach that stretch of creek with nowhere else to cross. But I have built bridges before, Miss Hart, and I expect you know your way around a length of rope and a length of timber better than most men twice your size." "I do at that," Charlotte said and felt, for the first time since the flood had knocked her into the roaring dark of Sweetgrass Creek, something that was not fear at all, but purpose, sharp and clean and entirely her own. They rode hard for the old ford, arriving as the light was failing, and Cyrus spent what remained of the daylight walking the banks with the same close, deliberate attention he had given the sign along the trail, assessing the old bridge's ruined footings, the depth of the water, the timber standing nearby that might be felled and dressed in time. Charlotte, dismounting to walk the site alongside him, found herself increasingly impressed by the sheer scope of what he was proposing, and increasingly certain, watching him work, that if any man in this territory could accomplish it in 3 days, it was this one. "The old footings are sound," Cyrus said finally, crouching at the water's edge to test the stonework with his hand. It was only the deck timbers and the 2 main crossbeams that failed, likely from neglect more than any deliberate hand, since Pruitt would have had no cause to sabotage a crossing this far from his ferry, unless he feared exactly this, that a man might think to rebuild it and undercut him. He straightened, looking up the slope at the stand of lodgepole pine growing there, straight and tall and exactly the right girth for the purpose. "We will need 8 good timbers, minimum, cut and dressed and set before any wagon or herd could trust its weight to them. It is heavy work, Miss Hart, the kind that breaks men half again my size. I am not asking you to spare me the heavy work, Mr. Bridger. I am offering to share it." Charlotte's chin came up, and something in her level, unflinching gaze seemed to settle a question in him that he had perhaps not meant to ask aloud. "I have felled trees before. I have set fence posts and mended corrals and hauled more stone than you might credit looking at me. Tell me what needs doing and I will do my part of it, and we will see whose back gives out first." Cyrus studied her a long moment in the fading light, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone rough with something that was not quite laughter and not quite wonder. "I begin to think, Miss Hart, that I have never in my life met anyone quite like you." "Good," Charlotte said simply. "I would hate to be ordinary." They made camp that night within sight of the ford, a small fire built low against the last of the day's warmth, and fell by unspoken agreement into the practice that would come, in the days ahead, to feel as natural as breathing. One of them keeping watch while the other slept, turn and turn about, in country where a man like Pruitt might well have riders out watching the crossings for exactly the kind of interference they intended. It was on the second of these night watches, with Cyrus sitting near enough the fire for its light to catch the strong planes of his face and Charlotte too restless with the ache of a day's hard labor to sleep despite her exhaustion, that the guarded truths began slowly to come loose between them. "You said I was the first stray woman you had found at a washed-out crossing," Charlotte said, watching him from where she lay wrapped in her blanket a few feet from the fire. "Have there been other strays? Men, I mean." "In your work?" Cyrus was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "There was a boy 4 years back," he said finally low. "Rancher's son, 11 years old, wandered off from a hunting camp in a snowstorm. His father hired 3 different trackers before me, and all 3 came back within a day, saying the trail was gone, the boy was gone, that it was a mercy to stop looking before the cold took the search party too." His jaw tightened, firelight catching the old grief still living behind his eyes. "I found him on the 4th day. Alive. Half frozen, but alive, tucked into a hollow log he had had the good sense to crawl into when the storm got bad. That is not a sad story, Mr. Bridger. That is the kind of story men should be telling about you at every trading post in this territory, instead of whatever half-true nonsense they do tell. His father paid me well and thanked me kindly, and then never spoke to me again in 4 years, because it shamed him, I think, that a man who looks like I look had succeeded where 3 respectable men had failed." Cyrus's voice had gone flat, controlled, the voice of old pain long since walled off but never quite healed over. "Folks are grateful for what I can do, Miss Hart, right up until they have to be seen standing next to the man who did it." Charlotte sat up slowly, drawing her blanket around her shoulders against the night chill, and looked at him steadily across the low fire. "I am not ashamed to be seen standing next to you," she said. "I have not been since the moment you pulled me out of that water, and I do not expect that to change, whatever fool notions other people carry around in their heads about a man's worth being written on his face or the length of his hair." Something in Cyrus's stillness broke then, just slightly, just enough that Charlotte saw the effort it cost him to keep his voice even. "You do not know me well enough yet to make promises like that. I know you rebuilt a stranger's trust in the space of a single afternoon, by doing exactly what you said you would do, and nothing more or less. Charlotte held his gaze, refusing to let him retreat back into the careful distance he had been keeping since the fire had first been lit. I know you have spent 4 days now working yourself half to exhaustion to save herds and families you have never met, for no payment beyond what is right. I do not need to know every story from every year of your life to know the shape of the man in front of me, Cyrus. That much I have already seen plainly enough. It was the first time she had used his given name, and the effect of it on him was visible even in the uncertain firelight, something in his broad shoulders loosening, some long-held guard lowering by a careful degree. "Charlotte," he said, testing her name in turn, low and rough and careful, as though it were something he did not quite trust himself to hold. "You are a dangerous woman to a man who has spent a good many years telling himself he does not need anybody's good opinion to get by." "I am not asking you to need my good opinion," Charlotte said softly. "I am only telling you that you have it." They sat a while longer in silence after that, easier silence than before, the fire burning low between them, and though neither reached for the other that night, something had shifted. Some careful distance closed a fraction that would not, Charlotte understood, be reopened again. The work of rebuilding the bridge consumed the 2 days that followed in a punishing, satisfying rhythm of felling and dressing timber, of hauling and setting and lashing, of Cyrus's enormous strength, turned entirely to the patient, careful business of construction rather than destruction, hefting crossbeams into place that would have taken 3 ordinary men to lift, while Charlotte proved as good as her word, working the ropes and pulleys they rigged to ease the heaviest lifts, splitting shakes for the deck surface with an axe she wielded with more skill than Cyrus, by his own grudging admission, had expected from any hand smaller than his own. On the morning of the 3rd day, with the last crossbeam set and lashed and the deck timbers laid, Cyrus stood back to survey their work with the same careful, assessing look he had given the ruined original, and Charlotte, standing beside him with her palms blistered and her arms trembling with fatigue, felt a fierce and simple pride swell up in her chest at the sight of it. A bridge, sound and true, spanning water that 3 days before had nearly killed her. "It will hold cattle," Cyrus said. "It will hold wagons if they are not overloaded. It will not hold forever without proper maintenance, but it will hold long enough to matter. Long enough to matter is all anyone in this valley needs right now." Charlotte looked over at him, and something in the satisfaction on his weathered face, the quiet, uncomplicated pride of a man who had built something good and lasting with his own 2 hands, struck her with a force that had nothing to do with the bridge at all. "You are a builder as much as a tracker, Cyrus Bridger. I do not think most people who tell frightened stories about you at trading posts have any notion of that at all." "Most people," Cyrus said, "have never had cause to see me do anything but hunt men through hard country, which does tend to color a fellow's reputation, whatever the truth of his character besides." But he was smiling as he said it, a real smile this time, unguarded, and Charlotte found herself smiling back before either of them quite noticed how close they had drifted standing there at the center of the new-built bridge, the creek running clean and swift beneath the boards under their feet. It was the sound of approaching riders that broke the moment, and both of them turned, instinctively wary, to see a small party emerging from the timber on the near bank. Whit Collier and Sam Ostrander, leading the small herd of bulls and heifers at a careful walk, and behind them, unmistakable even at a distance by his weathered range hat and the particular set of his shoulders, Charlotte's father, Nathaniel Hart. Charlotte. The old drover was off his horse before it had fully stopped, crossing to his daughter with the barely contained anguish of a man who had spent 2 days fearing the worst. "When Whit's message reached me that you had gone off with some mountain man to God knows where, I nearly rode this whole outfit into the ground getting back here. I am perfectly well, Papa, as you can plainly see." Charlotte submitted to her father's fierce embrace with the patient affection of a daughter well used to managing a worried parent, before drawing back to gesture at the bridge behind her. "And we have not been idle. This is Cyrus Bridger." He pulled me out of the flood at the old crossing and has spent the last 3 days helping me rebuild this bridge, because the one that washed out did not wash out by accident." Nathaniel Hart's sharp eyes went from his daughter to the towering, weathered figure of Cyrus Bridger standing quietly by, and something in his weary, careworn face sharpened with the particular attention of a man taking swift and serious measure of another. "Bridger," he said slowly, "I have heard your name. Sheriff Talmadge over in Deer Lodge speaks well of you, when he speaks of you at all. I have done some work for the sheriff, yes." Cyrus met the older man's assessing look without flinching, without the deference some men might have offered a father clearly wondering what his daughter had gotten herself into. "Your daughter has more courage and more sense than any 3 grown men I have worked alongside, Mr. Hart. I would be glad to tell you the whole of what has happened, if you have the patience to hear it, because it concerns your herd and every other outfit driving cattle through this valley this season." They told him together, standing there on the new-built bridge with the creek running clean beneath them, the whole tangled shape of it. The cut timbers, the pattern of sabotaged crossings, Otis Prewitt's ferry and its climbing tolls, Harlan Voss and the money changing hands, the trap being slowly closed around every outfit in the valley that had no choice but to sell cheap or pay dear or lose a season's herd to bad luck engineered from the start. Nathaniel Hart's weathered face went hard and cold as he listened, the particular fury of a working man who had spent 40 years earning an honest living only to find it threatened by men too cowardly to steal outright. "Voss," he said finally low, "that son of a snake shook my hand and called it a fair price. I signed papers on the strength of his word. You are not the only outfit he has done this to, Mr. Hart, and you will not be the last unless someone puts a stop to it." Cyrus's voice had gone hard in a way Charlotte had not heard from him before, the controlled anger of a man who had spent his life hunting down injustice in whatever wild country it tried to hide in. "This bridge buys this valley some breathing room this season. It does not end the scheme. For that, we will need real evidence and real law, and I mean to see both brought to bear before Prewitt and Voss can do this same harm again to some other family less fortunate than yours. Then you have my herd's gratitude, and my own besides, whatever help I can offer toward that end." Nathaniel Hart extended a rough, calloused hand, and Cyrus took it, the 2 men's grip holding a moment longer than mere courtesy required, some understanding passing between them that Charlotte, watching, felt a quiet gladness to see. The herd crossed the new bridge without incident that same afternoon, the bulls and heifers moving in easy, unhurried order over timber that held solid and sure beneath their weight. And Charlotte, watching from the bank as the last heifer's tail disappeared into the timber on the far side, felt something in her chest ease that had been tight and afraid since the moment the flood had first swept her off Delia's back. But the ease did not last. They learned the full extent of the danger 2 days later, when word reached them by way of a passing freight driver that Otis Prewitt, having somehow gotten wind of the new bridge and the threat it posed to his toll, had ridden hard to a stand of dry timber above the settlement of Willow Creek, a modest cluster of homesteads and a small church some 6 miles below the ford, and set it alight in a fit of vindictive fury, meaning, the driver said with grim certainty, to burn the new bridge and the timber around it before word of its existence could spread further and undercut his ferry's profits entirely. "Willow Creek," Charlotte said, cold dread flooding through her as she and Cyrus stood listening to the freight driver's breathless account. "There are families there, Cyrus. A church, a schoolhouse. If that fire is coming down off the ridge with this wind, then it will reach the settlement long before it reaches our bridge and burn homes and lives before it burns timber." Cyrus was already moving toward the horses, his whole bearing transformed into something taut and urgent, the stillness she had come to associate with him replaced by swift, decisive motion. "We cannot outrun a wildfire on horseback across broken country, not if it has real hold in that timber already. But there may be time yet to get ahead of it and burn a break before it reaches the settlement, if we ride hard and do not waste a minute arguing about who ought to go and who ought to stay behind. I am coming, Charlotte said, already swinging up onto Delia. Do not waste breath telling me otherwise. I was not going to. Cyrus was up on the buckskin in the same motion, and something in the grim, grateful look he threw her before they put their heels to their horses told her he had not, in that moment, even considered leaving her behind. They rode hard for Willow Creek, the sky ahead already smudged gray-brown with smoke long before they crested the last ridge, and saw the fire's true scope. A wall of flame moving through dry timber on the slope above the settlement with terrible speed, driven by a wind that had picked up through the afternoon into something fierce and capricious, throwing sparks and burning debris ahead of the main front in a way that made the fire's advance almost impossible to predict. Below, in the small cluster of homesteads, Charlotte could see people already moving in frantic, disorganized haste, wagons being loaded, children herded toward the creek, a few men beating uselessly at the fire's leading edge with wet blankets that could not possibly hope to slow flames of that size and speed. There, Cyrus said, pointing to a natural break in the terrain, a wide swath of rocky, sparsely timbered ground running along a low ridge between the fire and the settlement. If we can burn a controlled line along that ridge before the main fire reaches it, starve it of fuel in a strip wide enough that it cannot jump the gap, it will turn the fire's front, or slow it enough that the settlement has time to properly evacuate, and the bucket lines down at the creek have a chance to hold what ground they can. A backburn. Charlotte had heard her father speak of the technique, dangerous and delicate, a fire fought with fire, capable of saving a settlement if done right and capable of making the disaster twice as bad if done wrong or too late. We would need to time it exactly and watch the wind every second, or we risk sending our own fire down onto the settlement instead of the wildfire above it. Which is why I need someone beside me who will not panic and who understands wind and grass and fire as well as I do, instead of some frightened settler swinging a torch at the first opportunity out of pure terror. Cyrus's gray eyes met hers, steady even amid the smoke beginning to sting the air around them. I will not order you into this, Charlotte. It is dangerous work, and if the wind turns wrong even for a moment, it could go very badly for both of us. But I would rather have you beside me than any other soul in this valley, if you are willing. I am willing, Charlotte said without hesitation, already reaching for the small tin of matches she carried for camp fires, her heart pounding not with fear alone but with the same fierce purpose that had carried her through 3 days of bridge building. Tell me where to start and how wide to make the gap, and let us save this settlement, Cyrus Bridger. They worked the ridge with desperate speed, Cyrus reading the shifting wind with an instinct born of decades in this country, calling out to Charlotte where to set each new line of flame along the dry grass and brush. The two of them moving in a rough, practiced coordination as the fire they had lit ate backward along the ridge, consuming the fuel that would otherwise have carried the main wildfire straight down onto the homes and the little white church below. Twice the wind gusted wrong and sent flame licking dangerously close toward ground they had not meant to burn, and twice Cyrus was there, beating it back with a wetted blanket and sheer physical strength, his big hands and forearms scorched and blistered by the work but never once faltering, never once suggesting they abandon the effort. Charlotte, running the far end of the line with a torch of her own, felt the heat of it against her face like a living thing, smoke burning her eyes and throat, and understood in her bones, working alongside him through that terrible hour, exactly what kind of man had pulled her from the flood 3 days before. A man who did not flinch from danger when other lives depended on his steadiness, who trusted her enough to fight that danger at his side rather than sending her to safety and taking all the risk upon himself alone. By the time the two fires finally met and starved each other of fuel along the burned ridge, the light was fading into a smoke-hazed dusk, and below them, Willow Creek stood scorched at its edges but whole, homes and church and schoolhouse all standing. Families gathered at the creek bank in stunned, grateful disbelief at a disaster that had, by the narrowest of margins, failed to consume everything they had built. Charlotte sank down onto a blackened rock at the ridge's crest, exhaustion overtaking her all at once, and felt Cyrus settle beside her, equally spent. His big shoulders slumped for the first time since she had met him, soot streaking his face and his forearms raw and reddened where sparks had caught his skin through his rolled sleeves. "You are burned," she said, reaching for his arm before she had quite decided to do so, examining the angry welts along his forearm with a critical eye that had tended enough livestock injuries over the years to know real damage from surface pain. "This needs tending properly, or it will fester. It will keep until we are down off this ridge." But he did not pull away from her touch, and something in the way he watched her handle his arm, gentle and sure, seemed to ease some tension in him that the fire itself had not managed to loosen. "It will keep for the ride down, and not 1 minute longer," Charlotte said firmly. "I have salve in my saddlebag that my mother swore by for burns and worse, and I mean to use it whether you argue or not." "I would not dream of arguing with you, Charlotte Hart." There was real warmth in it now, unguarded, the smoke-roughened voice of a man too tired and too moved by the day's events to keep his careful distances in proper order. "Not after watching you run that fire line like you had been doing it your whole life." High praise from a man who has apparently been doing it his whole life. Higher praise than you know. Cyrus turned to look at her fully then, soot and exhaustion and something else entirely written plain across his weathered face in the fading light. "I have fought fire before, Charlotte. I have fought it alongside grown men twice my size who broke and ran the moment the wind turned wrong. You did not break. You did not run. You stood right there beside me and did the work that needed doing. And I do not think I have ever in my life been more glad of anyone's company than I was of yours on that ridge tonight." Charlotte felt her breath catch, something in his words landing with a weight that had nothing to do with fatigue and everything to do with the way he was looking at her now, gray eyes gone soft and open in a manner she had not yet seen from him. The careful walls he kept around himself lowered all the way down for the first time since the flood had first thrown them together. "Cyrus," she said softly, and it was not quite a question, though it asked one all the same. He reached up, slow and careful, as though he expected her to pull away and would not have blamed her for it, and brushed a streak of soot from her cheek with a thumb that was, despite its size and strength, unbelievably gentle. "I have spent a good many years telling myself a man who lives the way I live has no business wanting what I find myself wanting right now," he said, low and rough. "But I find I do not much care for that argument anymore, sitting here with you." "Then perhaps you ought to stop making it," Charlotte said, and closed the last small distance between them herself. The kiss, when it came, was as unhurried and as sure as everything else about him, his big hand coming up to cradle her jaw with a tenderness that belied the raw strength she had watched him wield all day. And Charlotte melted into it with a sense of homecoming, so complete it frightened her a little, even as she gave herself over to it entirely. When they finally drew apart, both of them breathing unsteadily, smoke and firelight and the ruined, saved beauty of the valley spread out below them, Cyrus rested his forehead briefly against hers, a wordless benediction that said more than any speech he might have made. "I do not intend to let you go easily now, Charlotte Hart," he said finally, voice rough with an honesty she suspected cost him a great deal to give. "I have not the practice at courting a woman, not the smooth words other men might offer you, but I intend to try if you will let me." "I have never much cared for smooth words, Cyrus Bridger," Charlotte said, smiling against the ache of exhaustion and joy both warring in her chest. "I would rather have honest ones from a man who has already shown me plainly enough what he is worth in a fight and in kindness both. You may try all you like. I intend to let you." They rode down off the ridge as full dark settled over the valley, and the grateful families of Willow Creek, learning what had held the fire back from their homes, pressed food and thanks and offers of shelter on both of them with an openness that made Charlotte's throat tight, watching Cyrus receive it with the same quiet, startled gratitude he had shown at the bridge's completion. A man clearly unused to being thanked so freely by people who, until that day, had likely only whispered his name with unease. The joy of the settlement's rescue and the tender new understanding between them did not, however, put an end to the danger they had ridden into this country to face, and word reached them within 2 days, carried by a grim-faced Sheriff Talmadge himself, that Otis Pruitt, having failed to burn out the new bridge, had grown desperate and reckless in a manner that threatened to turn the whole scheme from cold profiteering into open violence. "Pruitt has hired guns," Talmadge said, standing in the yard of Nathaniel Hart's temporary camp with the herd grazing peacefully nearby, his weathered face grim beneath his hat brim. "3 men, hard cases out of Butte, paid to make sure that new bridge of yours does not stand another week, and to make sure nobody talks too loud about Harlan Voss's arrangement with him besides. I have a warrant for Pruitt's arrest on the sabotage charge, thanks to the evidence you two have gathered, but I have only 2 deputies to serve it, against 3 hired guns and whatever loyalty Pruitt's own men still hold for him." "Then you will need more hands than 2 deputies," Cyrus said quietly, and Charlotte, standing beside him, felt the same cold, clear resolve settle over her that had carried her through the fire on the ridge. "I mean to be one of them," she said. "Charlotte," her father began, worry plain in his voice. "Papa, I have already faced flood and fire in this valley and come through both. I do not intend to sit safely aside now, while the man who has spent 3 days teaching me to trust him rides into a fight I have as much stake in as he does." Charlotte met her father's eyes steadily, and saw, beneath the worry, the same stubborn pride that had raised her to be exactly the kind of woman capable of saying such a thing and meaning it. "I can shoot as well as any man in this outfit, and I know that ferry crossing and Pruitt's habits better than any lawman riding in cold. I mean to help see this through to its proper end." Cyrus looked at her a long moment, and though Charlotte braced herself for an argument, what she saw in his gray eyes instead was something that looked very much like pride, tempered by a fear for her safety that he did not try to hide. "I will not tell you to stay behind," he said finally, low. "You have more than earned the right to see this through with your own hands, but I will ask you to trust my judgment on the ground, the same way I have learned to trust yours if it comes to real gunplay." "I can agree to that," Charlotte said, "so long as you agree to the same in return." The faint, startled smile that crossed his weathered face told her he had not expected the condition, and appreciated it all the more for its fairness. "Agreed," he said. They rode for Sawtooth Canyon at first light the next morning, Sheriff Talmadge and his 2 deputies alongside Cyrus and Charlotte, a small enough party against 3 hired guns, but one that moved with the particular grim purpose of people who had already faced down flood and fire, and did not intend to be turned back now by mere human wickedness. They approached the trading post from 2 directions as Cyrus had planned, timing their arrival for the mid-morning hour when Pruitt's hired men, by the pattern Cyrus had observed on their earlier scouting visit, would be least alert, having settled into the routine boredom of men paid to watch and wait for a threat they had begun to doubt would actually come. It nearly went smoothly. Talmadge's deputies took the 2 guns posted near the ferry itself by surprise, disarming them before either could reach for a weapon, and for a moment it seemed the whole confrontation might resolve without a single shot fired. But Otis Pruitt, emerging from the trading post at the sound of the commotion, proved less inclined to surrender quietly than his hired men, drawing a pistol from beneath his fine coat with the desperate speed of a man who saw his entire scheme collapsing before his eyes and had nothing left to lose by violence. "Pruitt, drop it." Talmadge's warning came sharp across the yard, but Pruitt, wild-eyed, swung the pistol not toward the sheriff but toward Charlotte, standing nearest him at the edge of the porch. perhaps calculating in his desperation that threatening a woman would buy him the leverage his failing scheme required. What happened next occurred in the space of perhaps 2 seconds, though it would live in Charlotte's memory afterward with the strange, stretched clarity of far longer. Cyrus moved, not toward his own weapon, but directly into the line between Pruitt's pistol and Charlotte, his enormous frame closing the distance with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size. And in the same motion his hand closed around Pruitt's wrist with crushing force, wrenching the pistol aside and up even as it discharged harmlessly into the porch roof, the shot's report cracking loud across the yard. Pruitt went down hard under the combined weight of Cyrus's grip and his own momentum, and within moments Talmadge's deputies had him properly restrained. The whole confrontation ended almost as quickly as it had begun, leaving only the ringing echo of the single fired shot and the shaking aftermath of a danger that had, for one terrible instant, threatened to cost far more than a bridge or a toll. Charlotte found herself trembling, not from fear for herself, she realized, but from the raw terror of having watched Cyrus put his own body between her and a fired weapon without a moment's hesitation. The same instinct that had thrown him off his horse to reach her at the flooded crossing now turned, in an instant, to something that might have gotten him killed. "You could have been shot," she said, when he came to her a few moments later, his hands still shaking slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline, checking her over with the same swift, thorough concern he had shown at the creek days before. "Cyrus, you put yourself directly in front of a loaded pistol." "I would do it again without a second thought, and you know it," Cyrus said, low and rough, his big hands cupping her face as though he needed to reassure himself with his own eyes and hands that she was truly whole and unharmed. "I could not stand and watch that man point a weapon at you and do nothing, Charlotte. I do not have it in me. And I could not stand and watch you throw yourself in front of danger for my sake, again and again, while I do nothing to look after you in return," Charlotte said fiercely, gripping the front of his shirt as though to anchor them both. "That is not the kind of love I want between us, Cyrus. Not one where you bear every risk and I simply receive the safety of it. I want to stand beside you in danger the way I stood beside you on that fire line, not be shielded from it entirely while you carry all the weight alone." Cyrus went still at the word love, spoken so plainly and without hesitation, and something in his weathered face cracked open in a way Charlotte had not yet seen from him, raw and unguarded and disbelieving all at once. "You would say that word to a man like me," he said, very quietly, "after knowing me not even a full week. I would say it to the man who pulled me from a flood and taught me to trust his strength without ever once using it to make me feel small," Charlotte said, holding his gaze without flinching. "I would say it to the man who fought a wildfire beside me and thanked me for my courage instead of scolding me for my recklessness. I would say it to the man who just now threw his own body between me and a bullet without a single thought for himself. I do not need more time than that to know my own heart, Cyrus Bridger, whatever anyone else might say about how quick or how strange this all seems." Cyrus made a low sound, something between a laugh and something far more overwhelmed, and gathered her into an embrace that was careful of her but held nothing back of himself, his big arms wrapping fully around her as though he meant, finally, to let himself have this one good thing without the old habit of guarding against loss. "I love you," he said into her hair, rough and plain, and entirely without artifice. "I do not know how else to say it better than that, but I mean it with everything I have got." "That is exactly how to say it better," Charlotte murmured against his chest, feeling the words settle into her like the first true warmth after a long, cold winter. "That is exactly right." Sheriff Talmadge cleared his throat with the pointed patience of a lawman who had a prisoner to see properly to jail, and a good deal of paperwork awaiting him. But there was no missing the small, approving smile beneath his mustache as he watched the two of them finally step back from each other, still holding hands, still looking at one another with the unguarded wonder of people who had just discovered something true and lasting in the middle of considerable chaos. "I will need statements from both of you," he said, "regarding the sabotage and Voss's involvement before I ride to Deer Lodge to see the full charges filed properly. But that can wait until this afternoon, I expect, if you two have other business needing tending to first." They gave their statements that afternoon regardless, thorough and precise, laying out for the sheriff's official record every detail of the cut timbers, the pattern of sabotaged crossings, the money changing hands between Pruitt and Harlan Voss, evidence enough, Talmadge assured them, to see Pruitt charged for the sabotage and destruction of public crossings, and Voss investigated for fraud in his dealings with every outfit he had steered toward that predatory ferry. Word would need to go out to warn other ranchers and drovers already contracted with Voss, but with Pruitt in custody and his scheme laid bare, the worst of the danger to the valley's ranching families had, in the space of a single tense morning, been broken. News traveled fast in that country, faster than any of them quite expected, and within a week the story of the cut bridges and the false toll and the mountain man who had rebuilt a crossing with his own two hands to save an entire valley's herds from ruin, had spread from trading post to trading post with the particular relish such stories gathered in the telling. Charlotte noticed, in the days that followed, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the way people spoke of Cyrus Bridger when his name came up, the old uneasy whispers giving way slowly to something warmer, more grateful, more willing to see the whole man rather than merely the size and stillness that had made strangers wary of him for so many years. Nathaniel Hart's herd, delayed but not lost, resumed its drive north toward the Bitterroot within the week, crossing safely by the new bridge along with 3 other outfits that had been converging on the same stretch of country with nowhere else to turn, and Charlotte rode with them as far as the valley's northern edge, where the trail would carry the herd on without her for the final push to the buyer who had, thankfully, proven entirely innocent of Voss's scheme and appalled to learn of it, and more than willing to renegotiate fair terms directly with Nathaniel Hart once the truth came out. "You are staying, then," her father said, when they paused at the ridge that marked the edge of the country Cyrus called home, his weathered face holding no real surprise at the question, only the gentle acknowledgement of a father who had watched his daughter's heart settle somewhere he had not expected it to, and found himself glad of it despite the surprise. "I am staying," Charlotte confirmed, looking back down the trail toward the timber where Cyrus waited with the horses, giving father and daughter their moment of parting. "I love this country, Papa, wild as it is, and I love him. I do not think I have ever been more certain of anything in my life." "He is a good man," Nathaniel said simply. "I saw enough these past 2 weeks to know that plain enough for myself, whatever the trading post gossips might once have said otherwise. You have chosen well, Charlotte, and I could not ask better for you than a man who would throw himself in front of a bullet without a moment's hesitation, and rebuild a bridge with his bare hands to save strangers he owed nothing to. He would tell you he owed them plenty, being one of them himself in every way that matters," Charlotte said, smiling. "But I take your meaning, Papa, and I thank you for it." They embraced, and Nathaniel Hart rode on north with his herd and his hired men, promising to write when the sale was properly settled, and to visit again once the season's work allowed it. And Charlotte turned Delia back down the ridge toward the timber where Cyrus waited, and found, riding toward him in the bright, wildflower-strewn light of full spring, that her heart felt lighter and surer than she could remember it feeling in all her years of hard, honest work across this beautiful, difficult country. The weeks that followed passed in a quiet, contented rhythm that neither of them, given the drama of their meeting, had quite expected to find so easily. Cyrus's cabin, which had housed only one solitary man and his considerable, careful silence for the better part of a decade, opened by slow and welcome degrees to accommodate 2, Charlotte's practical good sense turning his careful bachelor's order into something warmer without ever diminishing the deep competence and quiet strength that had first drawn her to him. She taught him, in turn, small things he had never had cause to learn alone. How to properly cure a hide for softness rather than mere durability. The particular songs her mother had sung while working cattle that made the long hours of range work pass easier. The simple, steady pleasure of shared silence that asked nothing more than presence. He taught her the deeper language of the mountains that had shaped him, the true names of peaks and passes that maps rendered only crudely, the patient art of reading, whether in the shape of clouds gathering over the high ridges, the particular quality of trust required to sit still in wild country and let it reveal itself to you rather than forcing your will upon it. And in the evenings, when the day's work was done and the fire banked low, they talked in the easy, unguarded way that had first begun on the firelit nights of their bridge building. Guarded truths given freely now rather than drawn out slowly, each conversation deepening the foundation they had built together in crisis into something built, just as carefully, in peace. Word came in early summer that Otis Pruitt had been convicted on the sabotage charges and sentenced to a term in the territorial prison, and that Harlan Voss, faced with mounting evidence of fraud gathered from a dozen other cheated outfits across the valley, once word had properly spread, had fled the territory entirely rather than face the charges building against him. His scheme collapsed as thoroughly as the bridges he had conspired to destroy. Sheriff Talmadge rode out personally to deliver the news and stayed for supper at Cyrus and Charlotte's invitation, the three of them sharing a meal and easy conversation in a manner that would have seemed, to anyone who had known Cyrus Bridger only by his old reputation, almost unbelievable. "The valley owes you both a debt it will be paying off in goodwill for years to come," Talmadge said, over coffee, watching the two of them with the satisfied air of a man who had seen justice properly served and something good besides come of it. "I have had 3 separate ranching families ask after you this month alone, Bridger, wanting to hire your tracking skills for entirely honest reasons, and not a one of them so much as mentioned your reputation as anything but a recommendation. I expect I will take some getting used to, being thought well of instead of merely tolerated," Cyrus said, though the warmth in his voice and the easy way his hand found Charlotte's beneath the table told her plainly enough that whatever adjustment the change required, he was finding it a welcome one. It was on a bright, warm afternoon near the height of summer, the wildflowers that had bloomed so riotously in the wake of that first spring storm now giving way to the deeper greens and golds of the season's fullness, that Cyrus proposed they ride down to the old ford together, the very crossing where Charlotte had first been swept from Delia's back into the flood, and where the two of them had spent 3 grueling, transformative days rebuilding a bridge that had, in the months since, carried a dozen herds and countless travelers safely across water that had once nearly claimed Charlotte's life. They rode down through country blooming with lupin and paintbrush, and the last of the season's balsam root, the creek, when they reached it, running clear and gentle now in the settled warmth of high summer, nothing at all like the roaring brown flood that had first thrown them together. The bridge stood solid and sure across it, weathered now by months of use into something that looked, Charlotte thought, entirely at home in the landscape, as though it had always belonged there rather than having been raised in 3 days of desperate, exhausted labor against a ticking clock. "I have thought sometimes," Cyrus said, dismounting and helping her down from Delia with the same careful, easy strength he had shown that very first day, "about how strange a thing it is, that the worst morning of your life and the best thing that has ever happened to mine both happened at this exact place." "It does not seem strange to me at all," Charlotte said, looking up at him, at the weathered, familiar planes of his face that she had come, in these short months, to know and love as thoroughly as her own heart. "It seems like exactly the sort of place where something true ought to happen. This water tried to take everything from me, and instead it gave me you." Cyrus reached into his coat then, and Charlotte watched, her breath catching, as he drew out a small, simple ring, fashioned, she saw as he held it out to her, From a piece of gold he had worked by some careful hand, set with a single small stone the deep gray blue of a mountain lake at dusk. "I am not a man of smooth words, Charlotte, and I do not expect I ever will be," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer bothered to guard against in her presence. "But I know my own heart plainly enough, and I know it has belonged to you since the moment I pulled you out of that water, and you looked up at me without a single scrap of fear in your eyes, only fierce and stubborn concern for your cattle, of all things." A faint, unsteady laugh escaped him. "I love you more than I have ever loved anything in this life, more than these mountains, more than my own solitude, which I once thought I could not live without, and now find I would gladly give up every day for the rest of my life, if it meant living it beside you instead. Will you marry me, Charlotte Hart, and let me spend whatever years I have left proving to you every single day that you were right to trust me, that very first morning at this crossing?" Charlotte, tears standing bright in her eyes, did not make him wait for an answer. "Yes," she said, fierce and certain and entirely without hesitation, the same way she had said it to every danger and every truth this remarkable man had brought into her life since the flood first swept her toward him. "Yes, Cyrus Bridger, 1,000 times yes. I have never been more certain of anything in my whole life." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled just slightly, for all their enormous strength, and gathered her into an embrace that lifted her clean off her feet, laughing now, both of them, with the particular joy of two people who had faced flood and fire and violence together and found, at the end of it, something worth all the danger and all the fear. A love built not on rescue alone, but on mutual courage, mutual trust, and the deep, abiding respect of two people who had chosen each other freely, with clear eyes, knowing exactly what they were choosing. They were married 3 weeks later at the small church in Willow Creek, the very settlement they had saved from the wildfire, the community turning out in grateful, joyful numbers to celebrate a union that had, in its way, become bound up with the whole valley's deliverance from Pruitt's cruel scheme. Nathaniel Hart rode down from the Bitterroot to give his daughter away, beaming with a father's unrestrained pride, and Sheriff Talmadge stood as witness alongside Whit Collier and Sam Ostrander, and even Otis Pruitt's own former hired men, now honestly employed by outfits across the valley, sent word of congratulations that spoke to how thoroughly the old fear surrounding Cyrus Bridger's name had transformed, in a single eventful season, into something like genuine regard. They rode out that same evening, after the celebrating had wound down into contented quiet, back toward the ford where it had all begun, meaning to camp there one last night before returning to the cabin that would now be truly, fully theirs together, a shared life built on ground that had once nearly ended Charlotte's before it properly began. The evening was soft and warm, the last golden light catching on the clear water running beneath the bridge they had built together, and Charlotte, sitting beside her husband on the same rocky bank where he had once pulled her half-drowned from the flood, felt a peace settle over her so complete it was almost startling, given how much danger and fire and hard, honest labor had carried them to this exact moment. "Do you remember," she said, leaning into the solid, familiar warmth of his shoulder, "what you said to me, that very first day, about most folks being afraid of what they could not place easy in a category?" "I remember," Cyrus said, his arm coming around her with the easy, protective strength that no longer felt like distance held carefully at bay, but simple, uncomplicated love. "I remember thinking you were the first person who had ever looked at me and simply seen a man, instead of a story other people had told about one." "I still see exactly that man," Charlotte said softly, looking up at him in the fading light, at the strong, weathered face she had come to know so thoroughly and love so completely. The one who pulled a stranger out of a flood without asking a single question. The one who built a bridge in 3 days because it was the right thing to do, and fought a wildfire to save people he had never met, and put himself in front of a bullet without a moment's hesitation because he could not bear the thought of harm coming to me. That is the only story about you I have ever needed, Cyrus Bridger, and it has never once frightened me." "No," he agreed, pressing a slow, tender kiss to her hair as the last of the daylight gave way to the deep, star-scattered dark of the high country, the creek running gentle and clear beneath the solid bridge they had built with their own hands, the same crossing that had once nearly taken everything from her now standing as the quiet, lasting monument to everything they had found instead. "I do not suppose it ever has." They sat there a long while in the soft summer dark, husband and wife now, bound not by rescue alone, but by every hard-won trust that had grown between them since that first terrible morning at the washed-out crossing. And Charlotte thought, listening to the water run steady and sure beneath the bridge that had brought them together, that she had never in her life felt so completely, so peacefully, so entirely at home.